time I thought I was going to lose my job, and I was so nervous about it. And so I understand how you feel about that. And he said, Dad, if you felt like if you lost your job, everyone you know and love was going to die, then you know what I feel like. That kid was not in a position to benefit from either hardcore behavioral interventions, which would have pushed him over the edge, or from warm, fuzzy kinds of things that would have given him some nice, cozy explanation for how things were going to go. He had to get settled before he was going to get anywhere. Please. So clinical psychophysiology, again, this is my definition. This may or may not comport with how other people think about this. This is my definition. That always, when we are working with the population we are working with, and again, we work mainly with kids with anxiety disorders, we work with kids on the autism spectrum, we work with people with migraines, pain kinds of problems which are intensely activating. With my group, we are always seeking to assure, improve, or establish physiological balance before or concurrent with implementation of other methods. Before we start pushing the car, we check the alignment. And if the alignment is good, we're going forward. And we're going to try to refine it a little bit more. If the car is way out of line, we're going to not go anywhere until we do something that gives us some sense that we now have someone who's a more prepared, more receptive learner, someone who can benefit from the kinds of things that we're likely to do. Please. So for us, most often the point of entry is at the brain or the body, very often both. Again, please. So what we're trying to do before we go anywhere else is get from here to the best approximation we can of here. To get from here to the best approximation we can of here. To try to get the vehicle in line before we try to move things forward. So think about those of you at Monroe-Meyer or Boys Town who work a lot with kids. Who is the easier kid to get to comply? The kid who's agreeable, who's calm, who can accept an instruction, may not agree with you, but is able to calmly deal with whatever it is that you're telling them to do. Who is the kid who is more likely to be able to be settled in their own bed? How are you going to get a kid into their own bed? Well, you can stick them in there, you can shut the door, you can let them cry it out, you can, all those kinds of things will work. Or you can get them to be calm and to be okay in a more general sense, and then you've got a much higher probability of a more rapid success, more expeditious success. Similarly, I worked in mainly behavioral pediatrics for a long time. Successful toileting is not an experience, it's an experience. I'm sorry. So if we want to have this process be a useful one, then let's go for calm first. And if we look at a more adult application of those things, who is the person who's going to do better in front of a group? Presenting. Okay? Person who's calm. Who is the person who's going to do better in terms of allowing their training as an athlete to express itself in competition? The person who can be calm. I just saw yesterday a nationally competitive tennis player. And we worked on some of these various things because this person would get into competition and then start thinking about their last shot, especially if the last shot was a bad shot, and then start to predict based on that shot what was going to happen next. And of course, what they predicted was invariably bad, and of course, it usually was because they were thinking about the last shot instead of thinking about the point they were in. So what we've been working on is being able to get yourself entirely out of that situation, to be clear and calm, and allow all of the weeks, months, years of training that you've done to be expressed through you During a tennis match is not the time to learn how to play tennis. Right? It's the time to allow whatever it is you already know to be allowed to express itself fully. And similarly in academic kinds of pursuits. So, here's what we do in our clinic. We combine biofeedback, which I will define shortly, including neurofeedback, with behavioral technology, acceptance and commitment therapy, relational frames theory, mindfulness training, and whatever other things might seem to be useful at the time. But this is really the core of what we do, and how and when we might introduce each of these elements depends on the person that we're working with, depends on the particular issue that we're working with, but most often some of these components are going to be included. Sometimes, if the person is calm, I might start here. If I'm assured that the vehicle is in alignment, I'm good. I'm going from here forward. Sometimes they just need a little tweak. Sometimes the person, and I would say more often than not, people who get to my clinic, my personal clinic, have already failed at 4 to 8 other therapies along the way. I tend not to get, can you get my kid to pee in the toilet cases anymore. But we're always thinking in terms of the entire system rather than, and not system therapy, like family systems, but systems in terms of how the organisms operate, please. So biofeedback is measuring, sorry about the length here, measuring and providing real-time information to an individual about some aspect of their physiological functioning to support desired changes in performance and health. So we're picking out some area of physiological functioning that we believe is associated with what, just send me an email. I have to write all that down. It's terrible. I'm sorry, what was I saying?
I don't know, I was right.
Okay, so what we're going to do is pick out some aspect of physiological functioning, and we're pretty aware of what those might be, and then say we're going to do something, we're going to give you some feedback, we're going to engage you in the process of learning something about how you're functioning that will have a positive effect on that will move us in the direction of straightening out the alignment of your personal vehicle. Please. I did pretty well. So, components of modern biofeedback systems. When I was down at Monroe Meyer, I worked with Keith Allen a little bit. Who are the Monroe Meyer people here? Okay. You know Keith. I'm so sorry. And maybe he's still doing this, but at the time he would put little alcohol thermometers on people's finger, okay, and tape it on there with this like special pink tape that people would use to put curlers in their hair or something, and then say, okay, now warm up your fingers. That's really slow feedback. That's really, really slow. Technology has advanced somewhat since then. So what we're interested in is providing feedback that's as close to real time as we can, right? We want to give people some sense of how you're doing right now. More importantly, how can you affect how you're doing right now? How are you going to change what you're doing right now? So, some kind of a sensor, some kind of an amplifier, a computer to process and store data, because usually that data are coming in a kind of analog way, and we want to convert into some digital presentation, and then some sort of feedback device, visual, auditory, tactile. So here's a guy who looks like he's doing, I'm going to say, probably surface electromyography and maybe galvanic skin response. So he has a sensor. The signal is being collected and amplified here. It's being processed by a computer and displayed here. 3 different, the Zen, fountain is optional. And the little bonsai thing there, whatever it is. Okay.
Lucky bamboo.
I'm sorry?
It's bamboo.
Bamboo, oh, okay, thank you. Okay, so common modalities, respiration, breathing, is a big one. Heart rate variability, galvanic skin response, how much moisture there is on the surface of your hands is a good indicator of how anxious you might be. Thermal or temperature, like Dr. Allen's little, alcohol thermometer. Surface electromyography. Electromyography is muscle, measuring muscle tension. Some of you may have had an issue or know someone who had some kind of a muscular issue, and neurologists will do needle electromyography. They poke these little tiny needles in and measure the conductance along the length of a muscle. Surface electromyography is much less intrusive. And then finally, electroencephalogram or EEG neurofeedback, please. The three we're going to talk about today in the greatest detail are respiration, heart rate variability training, and neurofeedback, or EEG. Okay, so I've talked nonstop for however long I've talked nonstop for. Questions or about anything that I've said so far? Wow, clearly there is not enough coffee out there. Okay. So here's something that I very often talk with my patients about. All of us are trained up in a particular orientation. We're all trained up to think in a particular way. Most of us, with a few exceptions, but in most settings, we're trained up to think in terms of diagnostic categories, not only to facilitate our communication with each other, but also to facilitate our communication with the insurance company, who at the end of the day is going to pay our bills, unless you're in a research setting. So we have these categories of things organized in our brain, and we're looking for clues as this patient presents him or herself, and we're trying to figure out, well, what is it that we can do to fit them into one of these discrete categories. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but this is the Indian proverb of blind men describing an elephant. And one of the blind men grabs the tusk and says, "Oh, I see, an elephant's like a spear." One grabs the trunk and says, "Oh, an elephant's like a snake." One grabs the leg and says, "No, an elephant's like a tree trunk or a great pillar. No, an elephant's like a rope." They're all talking about the same elephant. They're talking about their piece of it, right? For most of the people I work with, the elephant is a dysregulated nervous system that might present itself in any number of ways. One manifestation of that dysregulated nervous system might be problems regulating my physical activity level. So let's stick that in the ADHD category. One manifestation of this dysregulated system might be problems regulating my emotional state. Let's stick that in the anxiety category. One manifestation might be reading problems, sleep problems, pain. But at the end of the day, the elephant is a dysregulated nervous system. When we approach these things pharmacologically, typically we approach a piece of the elephant. Very often when we approach these things psychologically, we approach a piece of the elephant. Because we're all shaped up, we're all conditioned in this direction of identifying these discrete categories of things so we can fit things in there. Those of you who have worked with kids, when was the last time you saw someone who had only ADHD? I'm sure there's somebody out there somewhere, but no. They meet criteria for ADHD. They're also anxious. They have an identifiable, probably diagnosable sleep disorder. There are all kinds of things. The ADHD anxiety group is the one that travels together most often in my experience. But if we confine ourselves to thinking of them in terms of these discrete diagnoses, then we miss the big picture, we miss the elephant. So often what I talk to my patients about is, here's the real problem with your kid. They have a kink in their neurological hose. I don't know what it is. I can diagnose them as this or this or this, and none of those things is going to fully capture your child, which, by the way, will be very well received by individuals or patients because they know there's more to them than what goes on with a discrete diagnosis, but they've been hearing that discrete diagnosis, and part of what they're doing is making a calculation about whether or not they're going to respect the person who's giving them their diagnosis because they know there's more to it than that, even if I don't. So they have a kink in their neurological hubs. What does that look like? What we're talking about is dysregulation. These people are not well regulated. They don't self-regulate. They don't self-calm. They're not able to bring themselves into an organizational state. They're not able to get the vehicle organized. They are dysregulated. So that shows up in two primary ways: instabilities like migraines, sleep cycle disturbances, bipolar disorder, bruxism, teeth grinding. And those, when I'm talking about instabilities, I'm talking about something that occurs irrespective of what's going on in the environment, right? So you don't wake up in the morning and wait for something to happen and then come down with bipolar disorder. That's maybe, instances or aspects of migraines, for example, might be triggered by some environmental thing, but they exist independent of what's going on in the environment. That's what an instability is. The other way that dysregulation manifests is reactivity, meaning something happens in the environment, internal or external, and I overreact to whatever that is. I am tuned in the direction of being too responsive, too reactive to circumstances around me. My internal state may be relatively stable, right? You can be off, but stable. You can be, as we'll talk about in a minute, sympathetic nervous system dominant, but stable in being too sympathetic nervous system dominant. And then something in the environment can trip you over the top. So it may not vary widely from day to day. You're persistently off in a particular direction. And those things are responsive to environmental stimuli. Okay. I need about 5 minutes to get another cup of coffee and retune, so if we can take a break here and then we'll reconvene. All right. Okay, so
Two cake options.
just, yeah, please.
I always remind you.